Hello, I'm Dr. Rebecca Jimenez Husted from the USA. I'm here to talk to you about unstable ground and mud rescues of large animals. Let's go ahead and get to it. First of all, it happens everywhere, it can happen anywhere, and it really comes down to understanding some simple rules for how to approach these kinds of situations. So in an overview, we're going to try to keep it simple. We're going to talk about not using mechanical winches and helicopters and big excavators, those kind of things. We're going to talk about using PPE and wearing a helmet. Incident command, because somebody needs to be in charge. We've got to get an animal handler for the animal, not to pull the animal out, but to be able to control the animal. People positioning and keeping people out of the kill zone. Anywhere around an animal's body or feet is a really good place to get hurt. We're going to talk about calling the veterinarian early, providing patient care for the animal as a victim. Stay on the stable ground, using tools to get the straps under the animal. That's the hardest part, is getting something underneath the animal that's in mud or laying down in mud. Using simple manipulations to assist or extricate from these kinds of situations. We'll show you a lot of examples of that. And then split operations to prepare for another animal that may be also in the mud. Sadly, some of these things happen. It ends up being many different animals that are in the mud at the same time. So why is this relevant to you? Because basically there's always going to be somebody standing there willing to send you in there by yourself, doesn't understand what the problems with unstable ground, doesn't understand entrapment, doesn't understand the dangers of trenches, those kinds of places where we find mud, which includes some septic tanks. So that's technically, it's a confined space. It's got a ticking time bomb in it, thanks to Jim Green over in the UK making that note. And so it should be relevant to you and your job. And it also is relevant to you because this is technical rescue. Somebody said a long time ago when I was in one of my classes from a USAR team here in the United States, well, you're trying to move something that weighs 1,000 pounds and doesn't understand human language and wears steel shoes on its feet. And I really haven't come up with a better explanation since of what large animal rescue really is. These are some examples. If you're going down into a hole to get a calf out of the mud on rope, that's obviously a technical rescue, even if it's in that case, about a 150-pound calf. And then, of course, if the animal is a quarter mile in the dark, in the cold, in the woods in Maine, and you finally find it hours later and you're trying to extricate it, that's obviously going to be a technical rescue too, because the animal's so debilitated at that point, it really can't move itself. So you guys understand something about technical rescue and extrication. I'm not going to try to tell you what that really is, but unstable ground for this presentation really means any ground surface that doesn't support the weight of a large animal, potentially of the rescuers itself. That includes mud, septic tanks, surface ice rescue components. I'm not really going to talk about surface ice rescue. We don't have a lot of that in Brazil. And then, of course, it might include things like septic tanks also. So those are the kinds of rescue around the world that the fire service considers to be extremely dangerous, require specialty training, certification, and equipment to participate in. And what I mean by that, I mean the National Fire Protection Association. There's 3 standards or codes that are relevant to animals. One is NFPA 150, which is the life safety and fire safety for any animal housing. You can read any of these for free online. The next one is NFPA 106, which is the standard for technical rescue personnel for their professional qualifications. That's relevant as of 2021 edition. And recently, NFPA 1670 was pulled in with NFPA 1983 into 2500, which is now the standard for operations and training for technical search and rescue incidents, and rope in these kinds of emergency situations. So if you're not familiar with those and you're in the fire department, you probably ought to do a little Googling, and that will give you a lot of information about we do these things. So why do we need to learn about mud rescue in the first place? I'm just going to run this video for a few minutes and talk about some of the things that are going on here.
We can get something around the backside too.
They've got an excavator to be able to pull the animal out. Not always okay to use the equipment simply because you can injure a person. From the veterinary perspective, this animal is really old, ectothermic. I'm not sure whether it has an animal handling the animal's head with a halter or some form of head control. When I talked to the young man in the gray shirt, he explained that they hadn't really noticed that they gal is, she looks like a horse person that cares very much, but probably isn't a technical rescuer and doesn't seem to understand what
Hey!
the firefighters that are there are in appropriate gear for move and move nasty mud. However, they get underneath the equipment several times. They're trying to use some fire department hose to be able to lift or get underneath the animal. They understand the concept of a sling, but I'm not sure that they had ever done any technical rescue training. According to the guy in the gray shirt, the local fire department had not done that. They ended up being successful.
Come on, guys,
but the
make it
challenge
count.
is the communication between the executive
count.
driver and the people that are on scene.
Come on, Fiona!
Well-meaning horse people, but I'm not sure that they were making much of it. And they don't understand that you have the pressure based on how Pennsylvania and the United States work on pressure around the chest. When you have pressure around the chest and the abdomen, animals tend to go sort of into this catatonic state where they relax and they really can't hold themselves. It looks to me like their goal was to lift the animal slightly and then get it to move itself forward by using its back. That was never going to work because once you put pressure on the chest, the animal really can't help itself. These guys are in some really bad places around the animal. They don't have helmets on. We don't talk about PPE and things helmets put up on. And they end up in front of the animal where the animal can flail or hit them with its head or hit them with its feet. It's obviously a very sweet animal because it does not actually hurt.
She's slipping!
A couple of times it gets a little excited. Maybe somebody slapped it on the butt, which is a very ineffective rescue technique. And it flails a little bit, but it actually doesn't try to hurt anybody. The frustration is trying to get that equipment underneath the animal. We have some special tools for using the rescue program. Communication, incident command, does not look like it was fantastic on scene. It's not bad. There's several people that are giving commands to the excavator. That can always be very difficult. I don't know what they're doing here.
Get her out! Get her licking and chewing!
They think that it's going to drown. It's just fighting. A little bit of location underneath its chin would have helped a little bit with not having to keep its hand on the blood as much. There's a lot of yelling and shouting and screaming on scene from the people on the ramp, which really doesn't do a whole heck of a lot of good for the animal that's in the mud. And all it does is elevates everybody else's heart rate. The animal struggles a little bit here. They're trying to get that back strap on. It's hard to one pull point. It's hard to balance the load.
Come on, Fiona!
About 65% of the
Come on!
front end. And they couldn't quite get that straight. Finally, they get it on, and they're trying to get the animal to help itself. They realize it's not going to work. If you look at this young man's face right here, you can tell he's very frustrated. He's trying to figure out how to hit us. It's cold, it's wet. He knows that it's under time constraints. It's very challenging. In the end, they were able to get the animal out by picking it up and moving it forward. By some, I think that takes a couple of minutes. So you can tell that fire departments and animal folks, if they don't know how to work together with a veterinarian on scene, this could be potential injury for both the animal and for people, and it can be extremely frustrating. It takes a long time. This kind of stuff shouldn't take that long. So we see it everywhere. We see it in marshes. We see it out on tidal beaches. We see it in people's yards. And what people don't understand is a human can walk on the same beach that a horse can and won't sink. Why? Because fundamentally, it's a surface area problem. Their feet, if you take a look at this is my shoes, and I have big feet, so don't make fun of me. But a men's 12 USA size shoe and my about 200 pounds, or maybe a little bit more, we're not going to talk about that, is actually, I have a lot more room underneath my feet for support than my double-aught shoe size horse that weighs 1,000 pounds. I have a horse, her name is Ariel, and on the right-hand side, you can see her trimmings from her feet. It's basically the same size as the heel on my shoe. So 4 of her feet doesn't equal 2 of my feet, and she weighs 1,000 pounds. So essentially, here's another example. Here's a 2 shoe size horse that weighs about 1,000 pounds, and his foot, surface area wise, about as big as the big part of my foot, but together that's not going to add up to the same surface area for my 200 pounds versus his 1,000 pounds. So it's about a fifth. And that means that they're basically got a big weight on toothpicks, and it goes easily into the ground. And of course, with people, we would say, hey, don't struggle. But what does an animal hear? They hear murr, 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 murr. And of course they struggle because their instinct tells them to fight it and try to get out. So things that we don't want to do: don't use a chain. Please don't put something around the animal's neck and lift it out of something. That's true of any large animal rescue, but certainly not from a med rescue, because the actual vacuum effect of the mud around the animal's body is going to add to their weight. It's not just 1,000 pounds anymore. Now it's 2,000 pounds or 3,000 pounds because of that vacuum suction that's pulling on the animal's body. So obviously the head and neck are not intended as an anchor. Well, the head, neck, and the tail are not intended as anchors. I see people do these kinds of things once in a while, and I'm just going to tell you, don't use the tail as an anchor. I've got an example here that winches should never be used to pull an animal out. This is a picture on the right from many, many years ago in New Zealand, where there was a horse that was extricated from a mud situation by its tail and traumatically separated the tail, tore the skin. I've been trying to figure out how that happened over the years. In the left-hand picture, this is a dead horse that was donated for, once it was euthanized, to be able to learn something. So what we did was we lifted most of the horse, not even all of the horse, its shoulders were still on the ground, with a tractor from one pull point on the tail, and then we just dropped it just a little and caught it again. And just a little drop and catch, and what happened is the tail traumatically separated. And I know that's an awful picture, but this is actually the anus and the skin. So it tore right there above the anus, and the skin is all that's holding it. The bone, most horses' tails have about a foot of bone, and that includes there's nerves, there's muscle, there's the joints. And it actually, when we dissected it, I know this is sort of a gross picture, sorry about that, but what happens is it traumatically separated that and pulled all of the nerves. Horses use and cows too, they use their tail to be able to protect themselves from flies, to communicate with other animals. And to pull on that is like pulling your arm off. It's awful. This is the actual joint where it separated in this case. So I know those are awful pictures, but I wanted to demonstrate, please do not use the tail to be able to pull an animal out of anything. To manipulate an animal with 1 or 2 people moving an animal that's down, that may be true under veterinarian's orders, but please don't do that in a rescue situation. So what we want to do, we want to keep this as simple as possible. Use equipment to make ramps. Use equipment to move things around. Make it easier to access. Make it safer for your rescuers. And then deal with the mud once you get down to the animal. But we want to make it as simple as possible. We try to stay away from heavy equipment because we know that it gets animals hurt, it gets people hurt, and we don't want that to happen. This is a pretty extreme example where there was a lot of water that came through in a flash flood and basically concreted this animal in with the sand. The problem is that heavy equipment operator has to rely on someone to communicate with them, and it's really tough to do. Plus, you can't really tell where the legs are. And just a small starting to move and then realizing, oh my God, the leg is right there, you could really hurt the animal. And the other problem this is not effective is because as you start to dig, the sand or the mud in most kinds of sand will refill the hole. So you effectively end up burying it. And I'll show you some pictures of that here in a minute. Another thing that we really want to stay away from, it's not that it's bad, but horses in muddy situations often are easier to be able to pull out with some of the other manipulation methods. This is an excellent version of a vertical lift. This was done over in the UK, but it demonstrates, just looking at the picture, you can tell that this is a difficult thing to do. You've got to have the proper equipment. You've got to have really good coordination between your heavy equipment operator and your person down there in the hole. There's a lot, you're underneath the equipment, all those kind of things. So we're really not going to talk about vertical lifts in this lecture. That's a whole nother lecture that we can do some other time. It's fun. It's really dangerous. And the reason it's dangerous is once you set the animal down, if the animal is not sufficiently sedated, it can start to pull. And when that happens, a lot of bad things can happen. So stay away from heavy equipment. This is sadly a recent one that also demonstrates that sometimes you end up injuring the animal. I was not there. I don't know for sure what happened to this animal, but the fact that it died 5 days later, they were on the scene for several hours. They used both a winch and a tractor. Shows me that they didn't really know what they were doing. Doesn't look to me like they were using webbing. And usually when I can't find pictures of the actual rescue, that usually tells me that they were doing something that probably went wrong. So I can find pictures beforehand and after, but not during the rescue. Also, a firefighter got hurt, and we don't want any of those things to happen, and no PPE. So let's make things a little bit better and stay away from heavy equipment. In this case, this is to demonstrate to you that animals actually float on top of the mud until we start digging. So this calf, probably a couple hundred kilos here, is sort of floating on top of the mud. This looks like somebody had dug a water line there and it filled in with mud, and she's sort of trapped. So she floats on the top of the mud. She's got a large lung field. She's got a lot of guts that have gas in them, and it elevates in the mud. And what they'll do is they'll struggle, and then they lay there, and they're trapped, and they're waiting for something to happen. Like, what could happen? Am I going to get out now? How about now? And so they'll struggle once and then twice, and then when they get their 10th win, they'll try to struggle again. And when, of course, all the people show up, and we're excited, we're doing our thing, and we're trying to do whatever, they start to struggle more. So we start digging, and this is the same calf. And what happens is the mud starts to refill the hole. It looks to me like they've used the excavator. They've also got a whole bunch of hand tools. They keep digging, and eventually they keep digging, and they've effectively buried the cow even deeper than they did before. They finally got some webbing around the body. They understood that they needed to be able to do a sideways drag or perhaps a vertical lift. I hope they used a sideways drag. But the more they kept digging, they effectively buried the animal. And we really prefer not to make that happen. So safety on the scene is also part of your job, is to keep people out of the kill zone. So being down in the mud may be fun. It may be nice and cool, but it's not a real safe place to be. They've got some webbing on this horse. It looks to me like they're trying to set up for a sideways drag. Maybe this guy just jumped in. Maybe he's the owner. Maybe he got overexcited. Maybe they put him in the mud to cool him off. I don't know, but that's not really where I want to have you or have anyone. And of course, this one is a really tough mud rescue. This is really where we don't want anybody to be. This animal had slid down in the mud, and its leg is actually down in some roots, and the roots have wrapped around the hoof at the very base. And this young man is in there with a knife trying to cut those roots. And that's an admirable thing for him to do, but could you please put a helmet on him and then tie something around this foot, the other foot, and tie that off to a tree somewhere, or have somebody hold it so that it lessens the chance of the horse flailing and getting this guy right in the head. Really dangerous thing to do under these kinds of conditions. So very frustrating. I know he's doing the best that he can, but PPE, be in the proper position and coordinating to mitigate for any of these things that could happen is part of our job. So we want to get an animal handler. We want to make sure that that animal handler understands that their job, just like this guy, is not to pull on the horse. It's just to guide the horse or the cow, to give it some direction and possibly help lift its head at certain points in the rescue so that it doesn't drag. But we're not going to pull. It's not a place to chin ourselves or use as an anchor point. The halter and head control, sadly, is one of those things that if someone pulls on the horse's head, they're going to cause something called opposition reflex, and the animal will actually fight you. It'll throw its head back and effectively does the opposite from what you want it to do, which is to come forward or to help you move itself. So a lot of that comes down to animal handling. Obviously, some of the challenges that we have when animals are in these environments, it often is also very wet. And if the nostrils go underneath the water, we're going to have a drowning situation. So elevating the head, neck, and the nose, particularly the nostrils, above the water, if the animal's in the mud and rolls over off of sternal would be where it's sitting straight up. And if it rolls to lateral, it can end up with its head, and then you've got to fight to hold its head up. A halter will help you with that, but it's really tough to stay in a safe position for that. And in the right-hand rescue, this is David King over in Australia, and the animal is trapped down there. It also happens to be a blind horse, so really, really difficult. And what he's doing here is trying to elevate the animal's head out of the situation until we can get something underneath its chin. In the next picture, this is the veterinarian on the same scene, and what they've done is they've slid a lifeguard underneath. It's a flotation piece that's underneath that. It can be pool noodles, it can be a life jacket, it can be one of those rescue rings, whatever you can get underneath the animal's chin. And what they'll do is they'll put their chin on it and they'll stop fighting so hard, because it takes a lot of work to lift their head and neck and tip their chin up to be able to try to keep the nostrils out of the water when they're actually in these kinds of situations. This one is not just mud. This is also in the reeds of a pond on the edge. So you've got both things. It's very challenging to try to get pieces of webbing around the animal in that kind of situation. So a lot of people say, well, I'm going to bring in a boat. Well, boats make it difficult too. You can use boats for these kinds of things, or at least as a platform for working, where you could place your equipment, keep it dry, make it easy to see so it doesn't sink down into the water or the mud. But it is sort of difficult to coordinate because, of course, anything you do, the boat tends to sort of float away. So some person may have to manage that. In this case, you can tell that the animal's on the bank. It's also dealing with the mud. And what they're doing here is using that as a working platform and using some leverage to try to move the animal out. I'm not sure exactly what their plan was, but you can see that the challenges are when you're on top of the boat and not able to get into the mud. Anything you do is going to push your boat away from the animal. So I'm not saying it's wrong. I am saying that it makes it a little bit more difficult. So don't go straight to a boat. What you can do is use ground pads. Now, these happen to be inflatable ground pads that are used a lot in the UK, and we found them to be beautiful. I had one for about 15 years, and finally the plastic failed on it. But they're doing a cow rescue here. They've got head control of the animal, and they are spreading their weight on top of the mud, which is really the best solution, because it keeps the rescuers out of the muddy environment and keeps from impacting them. But then it gives you a working platform that you can get something underneath the animal to get a pilot line on, and we'll talk about those tools here in a minute. The ground pads, they could be an inflatable device. It could be pieces of plastic called rescue glides. It could be EMS backboard. It could be a piece of plywood. It could be lumber. It could be anything that keeps you where you can spread your weight while you're on the surface of the mud and keeps people out of the mud. In this case, they've actually put ground pads all the way around the animal so that people can access. This is the animal handler working with another animal handler here, and then this person is operationally putting on the pieces of webbing to be able to do a sideways drag. And you know, that works great. What I will tell you that does not work is if you put plywood or wood in front of the horse and try to get them to jump on top of it. It doesn't work. We've seen many people try it. Maybe you've got a special horse that you're trying to rescue that has claws and is able to grab. That may work for dogs, but horses are generally too large to be able to use that effectively. This is Astro. It's very world famous mud rescue many years ago, and he tried to jump onto the mud, and what would happen is as he jumped on, he would roll and slide. His feet would slide, and finally they decided to take the mud out of the scenario and just use it for ground pads instead of trying to get the animal to jump on it. And they used a sideways drag, and they were able to pull him out. So before we talk about that, I do want to mention that many animals end up in the mud simply because people ride them into the mud. Not that they mean to, but they do. And I don't take the saddle off until I'm sure that I don't need it. So what that means is it possible I can use the girth as my pilot line, attach my pilot line and pull that around underneath the animal? That would be great, because the hardest part of mud rescues is getting something around the abdomen of the animal. We want to use the abdomen. We don't want to use the head and neck. We don't want to use the tail. We don't have the feet. We don't like using feet either, but we don't have the feet to use. So let's avoid them. Let's not use those. And then, of course, we want to try to provide head support. In this case, this is a horse that was ridden into the mud. Sadly, they had already removed the saddle because they didn't know any better, but they did a great thing. They reached over and got some reeds and grass from the side of the river, and once they were talking to the MTTR, the Mustangs to the Rescue rep, she was able to tell them, hey, a field expedient may be to something underneath the shoulder and the head and neck. And what happens is they slid a whole bunch of that underneath the animal's head and neck. He sort of laid over, caught his breath. He's a young horse. He's healthy. And he was able to sort of slide onto his shoulder and slide out of this muddy situation. It was a very small, muddy situation, very acute, right down at the very bottom of that flat spot. So he was able to do that. That may or may not work in other situations, but it obviously worked very well for this situation. So what usually happens is people start digging. And when they start digging, what you'll realize very quickly is that a horse is huge, and particularly when it's down in the mud, its body sort of spreads out into a triangle. And that triangle is, this part down here is its belly, but it sort of flattens out. And then you have the withers up here. So you have to go all the way around to be able to get something underneath there. And that's almost impossible to do. These people are trying. And what happens is you end up with your face next to the mud and you're digging down in there. And if you don't think that it's true, take a 55-gallon drum, fill it with water, bury it about halfway in the mud, and try. You'll find it's almost impossible to do. Maybe with a tiny pony, maybe with a Doberman Pinscher, but you're not going to be able to do it with a full-size horse. And if it's a draft horse, you're really not going to be able to do it. So we do this in training. We've seen it many, many times in reality where people try to get their arms underneath the animal. They're digging and they're pulling, and effectively they end up burying the animal. So a smarter way to do that is to use some kind of a reach tool. The reach tool works great. The problem is if you use a straight reach tool, the animal is in the mud and you use the reach tool, it goes down and it never comes out on the other side because it doesn't have a natural curvature. So what we try to do is stay away from the straight reach tools, and let's use something like a Nicopolis needle. It's round and it's like a suture needle. It goes around, you attach the pilot line here, and then you pull this back, the pilot line, and then you can attach that to your webbing and pull it underneath the animal. In this case, he's using something called the Hampshire Strop Guide, which was designed by the folks in Hampshire that do a large animal rescue and BARDA. And this is about 8 feet long, and it's got a natural curvature. So what he's doing is he's sliding it underneath the animal. It comes out on the other side and pulling his pilot line back. So it's right there. It goes underneath the animal. It's going to come out somewhere right here, attach his pilot line, pull it back underneath the animal, and then feed your webbing underneath the animal. I do have a complaint here. They're pulling on the animal's head to try to keep it from drowning. What they could have done is use a little bit of flotation underneath the animal's head, and that would have probably been a little bit more effective. Otherwise, I don't have any problems with what they're trying to do. It's really tough. On scene, it's difficult to do. So we have a special tool. This is the original Nicopolis needle. This was basically a piece of metal bent around a tree originally, and it has some loops on each end to be able to attach your pilot line or attach a handle or a prusik that you can pull it on with. But you'll notice that this is a Nicopolis needle. It's about 6 foot long for a normal sized horse in the shape of a C. This guy's got on his PPE. He's up on a ground pad, in this case, a piece of plywood. He's got a harness on to be able to pull him out of the rescue environment if anything goes wrong. We've got head control. The animal handler is not standing in the situation with the horse. They're standing at the other end of the lead rope, and everybody else is doing incident command and doing their part and staying out of the mud. The person that usually ends up in the mud is either a rescuer or the owner. They get a little frustrated and they jump down in the mud. So we want to keep that from happening. So this is the more modern version of the Nicopolis needle. It has an attachment point, in this case, for water. Water comes on fire trucks and is pretty portable. It's not as portable as air, but it does work. This is stainless steel. It's 3/4 inch, and you can put a little bit of water through there, and it will push through the mud to be able to get your pilot line on. Obviously, this is in training. This is simulating some kind of flotation device underneath the animal's head, and ground pads, harnesses, etc. So the modern Nicopolis needle is changed a little bit more since the previous picture. And what we did was we put a bent elbow on it because we find that that prevents bending the hose. And it's got a couple of loops on it where you can attach pilot lines or your handles. And we put it, in this case, this is a training. We put it down into the mud, push a little bit of water, and it will come out underneath the animal right here, attach our pilot line, and pull it back. Same thing here. In this case, they attached a prusik as a handle. Very effective tool. A modified Nicopolis needle, this is what we started with in the very beginning, something simple, and that's basically a piece of pipe that has a natural shape as a C and plastic pipe, and they were able to push this through. This doesn't have, they're just using some tape to attach their pilot line. That's okay, that's not bad. You can tell that they've been doing some digging. So the officers are in the mud, all up and close and personal. The reason that's really dangerous is the animal can struggle. There was a sad situation a couple years ago in the United States where a young lady was riding her horse and she tried to get off and save her own horse, and her horse rolled over on her. Her mother was there and watched it happen, and the horse rolled over on her and wasn't able to move back, and she wasn't able to get out from underneath the animal, and she drowned trying to save her horse. So being too close to the animal in the mud can be extremely dangerous to any of our rescuers. So let's stay out of the mud. Let's use our tools. In this case, what we're doing at this point, we have our webbing on and we're ready to manipulate the horse, but we're concerned in this mud situation about the amount of traction or suction or vacuum effect on the lower legs of the animal. Remember that the horse's legs are 5-6 feet long, and depending on a draft horse, they can easily be 6 feet long, and they're way down into the mud, and you don't know if they're down straight, if they're cattywampus, if they're all bent, how they are in the mud. So what we do is we inject a little bit of air or water, just like the Nicopolis needle. Do you have connectors for air or water? This one happens to be the connection for air, which attaches to the SCBA bottle for a fire department. You have to make sure you've got the correct connections, but this is a really great little tool to be able to help break that suction effect as you get ready to make your manipulation, whether it's roll it out on a sideways drag or if you're going to pick it up using a vertical lift. Some people call them jetting wands. They're also called mud lances. There's several names for these, air knives, but they're very effective at being able to break that suction effect. And you can tell that this is the Nicopolis needle that they had used to be able to get that webbing around the animal in the first place. So you can also make a field expedient. If you have a long broom handle, duct tape your airline to the broom handle. You need a regulator because you don't need a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure in an SCBA bottle, and we don't need all that. We just need just enough pressure, maybe about 60 pounds, to be able to break that suction effect. And you can see, if you look on this horse's legs, they use that to get the animal out of there. And there's still a lot of mud that's attached to those lower legs because of that suction effect, but it does work. So that's a field expedient method. If you're hiking back into the woods and you don't have an air lance or a mud lance, then you can make this yourself with a long stick or a broom handle. So how are we going to attach things to be able to move the animal in the first place? We call this a sideways drag. This is one method of manipulation. The challenge for this is somebody does need to protect the head. If the animal is not sedated, it can protect its head. It will sort of lift its head up a little as you're dragging it. But if it is sedated or anesthetized or absolutely debilitated, it will not do that, and you can injure that downside eye. So we always like to have something on the animal's head, a towel, a head protector. There's several versions of that now that make it a little bit safer. And then, of course, we don't have the video of dragging the horse out, but once it's out, they wanted to rotate it.
There we go.
And they're just using some, these are called round slings or continuous loop slings that are used to affect they didn't have the webbing, but it's the same kind of idea. These lay flat, they're about 2 inches, they are relatively cheap, and you can attach it to all of your hardware for being able to make your rescue. So we use sideways drags out of mud almost preferentially. That it tends to be the easiest and best way to manipulate an animal out of the mud. If you pull them away from the legs, what you find is that the head and the legs sort of drag. Obviously, if you went the other way, you would buckle the legs and buckle the head. So you need to pull it away from the head and neck and the legs. So that's why we like sideways drags so much. They work great once you've got your webbing around the animal, but you do need to protect the animal's head and neck for its eyes particularly. So what we try to do is, in many cases, we roll the animal onto something. It could be a rescue glide. It could be a piece of plywood. We roll the animal on out of the mud onto that flat surface, and then we pull the entire thing. Could be plywood. It could be a rescue glide. It could be just about anything. In this case, this is the veterinarian wearing a helmet. That's great. And what he's doing here is trying to keep the animal's head from dropping into the water while they roll the animal onto the rescue glide or onto the piece of plywood in this case. So animal handler, I would prefer if he had a handle here and was standing up a little bit, but his main concern is not letting those nostrils drop below into the water. Thank you to Dr. Tino Martinez. He is a veterinarian, and I was so excited because he's got on a helmet and trying to keep himself safe when he's doing these kind of things. I think that might be a hockey helmet, and it's Canada, so that's relevant. And then we can use those sideways drags for anything. We've used them for giraffe. We've used it for cattle. We've used it for horses. So any of those animals can be done that way. This actually is a piece of equipment that's used for a vertical lift normally, and that's a Becker sling. However, they're using it in this case for a sideways drag onto a rescue glide, which is that green piece of plastic here. No harm, no foul. We like using those green pieces of plastic because they're sort of slick and they reduce the friction when you're doing something like this. Another example of a sideways slide or drag, depending on where you are, what people call it, we're using this edge protection that obviously if you pull the animal out across this rocky edge of the hole or the trench, you could impact the animal's skin. Animal handler is lifting the animal's head while they're making the slide, and they've protected the animal's head and face with a blindfold, which is great. I do prefer that the blindfold fall off if something goes wrong, but this is an anesthetized animal. So in this case, they weren't worried about that. They wanted to protect that downside head, neck, and eye. This is a video of a mannequin being dragged out that demonstrates to you what we're really talking about. They're making the lift. I wish they would have protected the head. However,
nicely done.
That's a nicely done example. These are being used as ground pads. That's the rescue glide, and they're using the sideways drag straps. There's several different ways you can manipulate the straps. This is the simple way. But the biggest thing here is using incident command. Everybody's got PPE on. They've got the person that's calling the pull, and they don't have any tripping hazards behind them while they're making that pull. You'll notice it takes a lot of people to do that.
right, count 3, we'll pull. 1, 2, 3. Go, go, go.
Nicely done.
Nicely done. You're going to need a lot of people to help. You're talking about a 1,000-pound animal, in some cases a 2,000-pound animal. Large dairy cows, draft horses can be huge. So the average person can pull about 50 pounds, 25 kilos. So you're going to need a lot of people to be able to help on your webbing. Again, people always pull out the winches and the tractors, but they don't have feel. They don't understand that they're hurting something. So I prefer to use people. If I'm going to use mechanical advantage, I use something that can break in the system or that I can cut if something goes wrong. That would be really important to try to make things safe for the animal. So at some point, we bring it all together. We have our incident command set up. This is a practice. This is with a mannequin. This is the Resquit mannequin that's from the UK. But we have head protection for the animal. We're using incident command. You can tell that the rescuers here have on a harness. They have on their PPE. They're using their gloves. They're using reach tools. In this case, the Nicopolis needle with air injection that they pushed it in this way, attach their webbing right here, their pilot line, and then they're pulling their pilot line back over this side. And this guy's using the reach tool on this side to be able to help pull this one back this way. We've got our ground pads for access around the animal. We've got pool noodles underneath the animal's chin to keep it from getting caught. And by the time we use all of our tools, we should be able to get our sideways drag in the correct form around the animal's body. One piece of webbing, I really like 4-inch webbing or the continuous loop slings that are useful for this. Right behind the front legs and directly behind the back leg, in front of the back legs, to be able to pick up the animal as you roll it out of the webbing. So I'll demonstrate that with a little video here.
All right,
The same
come
situation.
on, you can do it.
At this
Everybody
point, they've got the
pull.
straps
Everybody
around,
pull.
and
You're
what they're
getting
doing is
there.
they're injecting air
Getting
to break
there.
the
Good
suction
job.
effect
Come on, you can do
of the
it.
mud.
Come on, kiddos. Motivational.
Notice
This is church.
how many people it takes. In this case, it is so difficult to do that what they did was they had to pull the webbing, pull the horse a little bit this way, then they pulled the horse a little bit that way, they pulled the horse a little bit this way, and by doing that in the mud while they're breaking the suction effect, they were able to pull it back and forth and work it out a little bit. In real life, a horse will actually struggle and help get it out of the mud. So if you want to practice with mud rescue, what you can do is put someone in a Tyvek suit, put them in a harness, and set up a 3-to-1 to a high point. Give them the rope. Give them the rope because their entire weight is going to be on that harness, which is between their legs and it's on their crotch. So they need to be able to control that, see what's dangerous. You don't want to pull them in half. People have been pulled in half doing this kind of thing, not for a training, but in a real live rescue. We don't want to do that. So what we do is we put a dynamometer in the middle. And when we did this recently with a training, we found that the subject that we had put down into that 55-gallon barrel with mud and water was able to lift himself, the mud, the water, the barrel, everything off the ground. Just about that far, and then he set it back down by pulling on the webbing. But the point is, really, really amazing that he was able to do that. Huge weight. And then, of course, we use our mud lances, put the air down into the mud next to his feet and around his legs, and he was able to pull himself out very easily from this mud. So that's a great way to practice it and convince yourself. Of course, you can also put on your boots and walk across the paddock, right? So, a couple scenarios here to demonstrate what we're talking about. These are professional teams that have been doing these kind of things in most cases. The vet is there, the animal handler, she's got a head protector on the animal. They set it up for success. This is the incident controller. They have their team show up. This is Little Fork Fire Rescue in Virginia. They use their reach tools to move the pieces of webbing around. They used a Nicopolis needle to get it around the animal's body. They do a sideways drag using their rescue glides to get the animal out of the situation. And then they have a veterinarian there to be able to treat the animal once they've got it out of the the situation. This is over in the UK. This team had horses in a muddy field. They had to move the animals quite a distance. So they anesthetized the animals, rolled them onto a tarp to get their whole body above the muddy grass. And then they were able to roll them onto that inflatable rescue path, move the entire thing away to get it to stable ground. And then they rolled the animals off and let the animal stand up. That's a great example of field expedience, what you got and how can you use it. That's not a standard mud rescue, but it obviously worked. This is another scenario in Oregon, in the United States, a couple of years ago. This animal rode into an area that looked like it had just a lot of grass, but obviously there was a trench or muddy area there. That's the owner holding onto her horse, still has the saddle on the horse. That was great. She left the saddle on, waited, called for help. She knew that if she called the Deschutes River Fire Department in Redmond and MTTR, which is Mustangs to the Rescue, that they would bring a team. They showed up. This is the veterinarian and the owner. They've got head protection. This is the Haast Becker head protector on the horse. The fire department's there, and what they're doing is using the girth on the saddle to pull their webbing around the animal to set it up for something we call a forward assist. Often we use sideways drags, but they use the forward assist. In this situation, they thought the animal could sort of move itself forward. And this is Kate Beardsley. She's the incident commander, and she's giving the directions to the team. We've got the forward assist on. Let's move the animal forward in the Swiss seat configuration, and the animal was able to jump forward and get itself out of the mud and then stand. And of course, the veterinarian's on scene, so you're able to treat the animal almost immediately. And that's really convenient. Sometimes that's not possible. In this case, in New York, a couple years ago, this is Patterson County Fire Rescue. They had a horse that was being ridden, got loose from the owner, went running out through the dark, and was found several hours later in freezing conditions, still with the saddle on. They were able to get their resources there. They were trying to do something that is difficult in thick mud, but apparently this is sort of thin mud with a whole bunch of other obstacles like limbs and trees. They moved those obstacles out of the way, and they were able to leverage the horse a little bit out of the mud with the backboards. They didn't remove the saddle until they leveraged the horse onto some plywood. They obviously had a lot of people that were working together on this. They used rope in this case to do their sideways drag. I prefer not using rope. I like to use wider webbing than rope because rope can really cut into an animal. But it's not stupid if it works. At this point, they removed the saddle and successfully leveraged the horse further out with using the backboards onto the plywood. Just make that note about not using rope around an animal's body because they weigh a lot and it really can impact them. Lastly, what we want to think about is making sure we get the animal to sternal. The sternal is a recovery position for animals because they can use both lungs, they can get their mentation back, and often they will stand when they are ready. Hard sometimes to get the owner or well-meaning bystanders. They want to see the animal stand, and they'll fight to get the animal to stand. And I'm like, just give the animal a little bit of time. He will get up when he can after the treatment, after he's gotten a chance to breathe, he gets his oxygen level up, and then he'll stand. So we like using that sternal recovery position. This is that same scenario in New York, and they've rolled him to sternal. They're also wicking, in other words, sucking with the towels all the water off the animal so that they can try to get him warm. The veterinarian is running some fluids into the animal, warm fluids, to try to get his hypothermia solved. And obviously dehydration, the animal's been there for a few minutes. So we want to keep him in a situation where he's going to be able to recover himself and walk out. Worst case, you have to put him on a rescue glide, but pulling him a quarter mile in the dark down a woodsy path isn't going to be a lot of fun. Much better if you can get the animal to walk himself. Great job in that situation. In conclusion, this is what we talked about. Wear your PPE. Keep people out of the kill zone. Get your animal handler involved. Don't let them pull on the animal's head. Stay on safe ground. Use some tools to get the straps underneath, and use your simple manipulations to assist and extricate the animal. Sometimes you may have to use split operations. You've got 2 animals in the mud, 4 animals in the mud. There's been several situations where I've seen that occur. One animal goes in, another animal goes in next to it. So how can you do that to prepare? Or you lift one out or slide one out, and then you're ready to get the next one in sequential order. Obviously, the veterinarian will help you do some triage there and see which one needs to come out of the mud first. I really appreciate you having me speak. This is Ariel, one of my demonstrators, and we do training all over the globe for large animal rescue, and I am thrilled to be invited to speak. This is my contact information if you need to get a hold of me. We have a Facebook study group. It's called Technical Large Animal Emergency Rescue. There's about 19,000 people on it. It's international. It is a study group. It is not a prayer group. So I encourage people to get on that group, interact. If you need to get a hold of me, that is my email and my cell phone. And I greatly appreciate you having me today.